Danny said it like he was reading off a menu. Mom, you were just the cook. Dad built this restaurant. Now Dad's gone, and I'm running it. Your name was never on anything that mattered. He said it in the dining room, our dining room. The one Vincent and I had painted together on a Sunday in 1994, both of us laughing because we'd chosen the wrong shade of red and it looked like the inside of a tomato. We repainted it the following weekend, a deeper red. The color of good luck, Vincent said. The color of something that lasts. Danny said it in front of Gerald Park, the attorney he'd hired, a man in a gray suit who kept his eyes on his folder the entire time. In front of Philip, my older son, who had flown in from Portland and was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table, the way he used to sit as a boy when he knew something was wrong but didn't yet know what to do. In front of 2 staff members Danny had asked to stay after closing, probably so the room would feel more official, more final. I was sitting at the head of the table. I had always sat at the head of the table. I looked at my son, my younger son, the one I had nursed through 3 ear infections before his 5th birthday, the one who used to fall asleep in the kitchen on a folded tablecloth while I prepped broth at midnight, and I said nothing. I smiled. Just slightly. Just enough. Danny blinked. He had expected tears, maybe shouting. Maybe the kind of collapse that would make everything easier for him. The kind that would let him say afterward, she couldn't handle it. She's getting older. It was the right decision. He had not expected a smile, and so the smile unsettled him in a way that nothing else could have. Gerald Park looked up from his folder for the first time. Philip's jaw tightened. I folded my hands in my lap and let the silence sit. Outside, a motorbike passed on the street. The sound faded slowly, the way sounds do late at night in a city that is almost but not quite asleep. The ceiling fan turned overhead, the same fan Vincent had installed himself in 2001, because the original one wobbled and he said a wobbling fan was bad for business, bad for the mood of a room, bad for the soup. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I thought about the tin box. Blue, slightly dented on the left corner, painted with a faded floral pattern that had mostly worn away. It had once held almond cookies my mother sent from her village the year Philip was born. Vincent had emptied it carefully, washing it out, setting it to dry on the windowsill, and then he'd folded the first document inside the EIN confirmation letter, just arrived, still crisp, and placed the tin on the shelf above the desk in the back office. He'd patted the lid twice and said, in that quiet way he had, "This box outlasts everything, Han, even me." I had not fully understood what he meant then. I understood now. That tin box was sitting on the shelf in my bedroom at home, under the framed photograph of Vincent on our wedding day, next to the incense holder I lit every morning. It had been sitting there since the week after his funeral, when I quietly moved it from the restaurant without telling anyone. Not because I had planned anything, not because I suspected anything, not then, because it was ours. Because his hands had touched it first. I let Danny finish speaking. He talked for another several minutes, something about operational continuity, something about how the transition had already been filed, something about how he hoped I would understand that this was a business decision and not a personal one. Gerald Park slid a document across the table toward me. A summary sheet, it looked like. Numbers and dates in 2 neat columns. I did not reach for it. Philip said quietly. Danny said, "Phil, we've been through this." Philip said nothing else. But he looked at me. And I looked back at him, and something passed between us that did not need words. He had always been the quieter one, Philip. The one who watched. He came by it honestly. I have been watching longer than any of them know. There is a saying I grew up with, one my own mother repeated so often it became part of the rhythm of our household, as familiar as the sound of rain on a tin roof, as ordinary as the smell of rice cooking before dawn. Still water runs deepest. She meant it about people. She meant it about herself, standing in a kitchen that was not large enough, and a life that was not easy, running a household of 5 children on what my father brought home from the market. Still water. The kind that shows you your reflection perfectly because nothing disturbs the surface. I had been still for 30 years. The restaurant had not always been a restaurant. It had been a dream first, then a plan, then a lease agreement on a narrow shop house that smelled like motor oil, and the previous tenant's regrets. Vincent had shown me the space on a Thursday evening. I remember the light low and yellowish, coming through one dirty window. I remember thinking, this is not possible. And then thinking, yes, but we have done things that were not possible before. We opened 8 months later. I cooked every dish on that first menu myself. I wrote the recipes in a notebook with a blue cover, adjusting measurements as I went, learning what a dining room full of strangers needed from a bowl of soup, what made someone set down their spoon and close their eyes for just a moment. I learned to run a kitchen. I learned to run a front of house. I learned payroll, vendors, health inspections, the precise tone of voice needed when a customer complained unreasonably and you had to make them feel heard without agreeing with a single word they said. I learned all of it. Danny had been in middle school for most of it. Now he sat across from me in the room his father and I had built, in the chairs we had chosen, under the fan Vincent had installed with his own hands, and told me my name had never been on anything that mattered. I smiled again, just slightly, and said, "Thank you, Danny. I heard everything you said." He looked relieved. That was his first mistake. Gerald Park gathered his papers. Philip stared at the table. The ceiling fan turned and turned. I thought of my mother's voice, low and unhurried, saying it the way she always did, not as a warning, not as a lesson, just as a fact about the world. Still water runs deepest. I stood, pushed my chair back neatly, and picked up my purse. No one in that room knew about the tin box. Not yet. Vincent never learned to sleep past 5 in the morning. I used to tease him about it, early in our marriage. When I still believed that weekends were meant for rest, he would be up before the sky changed color, moving quietly through the house in his undershirt and old trousers, brewing tea he wouldn't finish, standing at the kitchen window with his hands wrapped around the cup, looking at nothing in particular. Just looking. I would lie in bed listening to the small sounds of him, the soft knock of the cup on the counter, the creak of the third floorboard near the hallway, and feel something I didn't have a word for then. Certainty, maybe. The certainty of a life that was exactly where it was supposed to be. We had been married for 6 years before we opened the restaurant. 6 years of Vincent working at his uncle's hardware business, coming home smelling like sawdust and machine oil, tallying figures in a notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. 6 years of me working the morning shift at a hotel kitchen downtown. Learning the geometry of feeding strangers how much a body needs, how warmth travels from a bowl through a pair of cold hands and into the chest where it matters. We saved carefully. We did not take vacations. We did not buy things we could not carry into the next year. The restaurant was Vincent's dream first. He had sketched the floor plan on a paper napkin at a noodle shop on Phong Dinh Phung Street the year before we left for the United States, and he'd kept that napkin folded inside his wallet for 15 years. By the time he showed me the shop house on a Thursday evening, dim light, dirty window, the ghost of someone else's failure still hanging in the air, the napkin had worn soft as cloth at the folds. He spread it flat on the empty counter. The sketch matched the room almost exactly. I should have realized then that he had been looking for that room his whole life. We built it together. That is the only honest way to say it. Not Vincent with my support, not me helping Vincent's vision together, the way two people build something when neither of them has enough alone. I designed the menu. I sourced the suppliers, drove to the wholesale market on Saturday mornings when the good produce came in, learned which vendors could be trusted and which ones required watching. I hired the first kitchen staff, trained them, let 2 go when I understood they were not right, hired again. I kept the books in those early years, before we could afford an accountant, writing every expense and every dollar of revenue in a ledger I still have somewhere in the back bedroom. Philip was 7 when we opened. He used to do his homework at the corner table near the window, the one we always kept for family. He never complained about the noise or the smell or the irregular hours. He just sat there with his school books and occasionally looked up at the kitchen pass-through to check if either of us was visible, the way children do when they need to know you haven't disappeared. Danny was born the year after we opened. I remember thinking, holding him in the hospital, that he had come into a family that was already in motion, already building, already shaped by something larger than any of us. I thought that was a gift. A child born into momentum. I thought many things that turned out to be wrong. But I am not at that part yet. The house we live in now, the house I live in alone since Vincent died, is on a narrow lane 3 blocks from the restaurant. We bought it when Philip started secondary school and we needed more rooms, more permanence, more of the feeling that we had arrived somewhere worth staying. The ceilings are high, which Vincent loved, because he said low ceilings made a man feel like he was being managed. The front room has a tiled floor in a pale green that shows every footprint but that I have never wanted to replace. The smell of the house is incense and old wood and, faintly, always, the garlic and ginger that have worked their way into the walls over 30 years of cooking. Vincent's altar is in the main room, against the east wall. I set it up the week after the funeral, arranging things the way I thought he would want them. His photograph from our wedding, younger than I can fully believe when I look at it now. A small vase of fresh flowers I replace every Monday. The incense holder I light each morning before I do anything else. The smoke rises and thins and disappears, and I have learned to find that comforting rather than sad. Things that disappear are not always gone. Sometimes they are simply somewhere the eye cannot follow. I keep the tin box on the shelf to the right of his photograph. It was his hands that put the first document inside it. His hands that washed it, dried it, placed it carefully in position. The box belongs to both of us, which means it belongs to me now, and I have not once considered moving it, donating it, replacing it with something newer or less dented. The dent in the left corner happened when Philip, at age 11, knocked it off the shelf while reaching for something above it. Vincent just picked it up, checked the documents inside, pressed the lid back down, and put it back. No scolding, just the quiet reassurance of someone who knew what mattered and what didn't. After the meeting with Danny and Gerald Park, I came home to this house, to this room, to this altar. I lit the incense. I stood in the smoke for a moment, the way I always do, feeling it move around me. I looked at Vincent's photograph. That particular look he had in it, not quite smiling, just present, just entirely himself, had always made me feel, even in the hardest years, that I was not operating alone. That somewhere behind whatever difficulty I was navigating, there was a person who had looked at me and decided I was worth building a life beside. That kind of certainty doesn't disappear when a person does. It becomes structural. It holds things up. I said nothing to the photograph. I rarely do. But I put my hand on the tin box, just for a moment, the way Vincent used to pat its lid. Then I went to the kitchen, made tea I didn't finish, and stood at the window in the dark. Something had shifted the night of Danny's announcement. I could feel it the way you feel, a change in weather not yet visible, not yet fully formed, but present in the air, in the pressure, in the particular quality of the silence. Danny had spoken his piece and considered the matter settled. He had always been careless about what he considered settled. I stood at the window until the lane outside went completely quiet. A dog somewhere distant, a motorbike, then nothing. The incense had burned low. The house breathed around me, old and patient and full of everything it had witnessed. I was not afraid. But I was paying attention now in a way I had not been before, and I found myself wondering how long, exactly, the signs had been there and how many of them I had chosen, without fully knowing it, not to see. The first sign was a door. Not locked, I want to be precise about this, simply closed in a way it had never been closed before. The office at the back of the restaurant, the small room with the desk and the filing cabinet, and the shelf where Vincent had first placed the tin box, had always had an open-door policy. That was Vincent's phrase for it, said half-jokingly, because the door itself was warped along the bottom edge and required a firm pull to shut properly, and neither of us had ever bothered. For 30 years, that door stood open. Staff walked past it freely. I did my bookkeeping with the sounds of the kitchen behind me, the rhythm of prep work, the occasional burst of steam from the stove, the voices of people who knew their jobs and did them without being managed. 3 weeks after Danny's meeting with Gerald Park, I arrived at the restaurant on a Tuesday morning, and the office door was closed. I noticed it the way you notice when a piece of furniture has been moved slightly. The room is the same, the furniture is the same, but the negative space has shifted, and your body registers the change before your mind does. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I pulled the door open. Danny was inside, sitting at the desk. His laptop was open. Several folders I did not recognize were stacked beside the keyboard. He looked up without surprise, which meant he had heard me come in, which meant he had been waiting to be discovered and had decided how he would handle it. Mom. He closed the laptop part way. Not fully. Part way. You're early. I'm always here at this time, I said. I have been for 30 years. He smiled. That particular smile he had developed sometime in his 30s, practiced, patient, designed to suggest that the person he was smiling at was being gently unreasonable. I know. I just meant I have a call in a few minutes. Can we talk later? I looked at the folders on the desk. I did not reach for them. I said, of course, and I left the room, and I pulled the door closed behind me with the firm tug it required. I went to the kitchen and began doing what I had always done. I checked the prep station, spoke with our head cook, who had been with us for 11 years and who greeted me the way she always did, with a nod and a brief report on what had been ordered and what was running low. The morning moved through its familiar shapes, the kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and stock. The first lunch customers arrived before 11, the regulars who came not because the food changed but because it didn't. But I was thinking about those folders. I did not go back to the office that day. I waited. Patience is not passivity. I had understood this for a long time, though I could not have articulated it when I was young. Patience is a form of intelligence. It is choosing to gather information rather than force a confrontation before you know what you are confronting. I came back on Thursday. The door was closed again. This time I knocked before opening it. Iris was inside, alone. She was standing at the filing cabinet with one drawer pulled open, leafing through folders with the focused efficiency of someone who knew what they were looking for. She was dressed the way she always dressed, neat, composed, a woman who understood the value of appearances, but there was something different in her posture when she turned and saw me. A fractional stiffening, a recalibration. Han. She had never called me Mom. From the beginning, it had always been Han. I had chosen not to make an issue of it. I was reconsidering many such choices now. I'm just organizing some vendor files. Danny asked me to update the system. Which system? The filing system. She gestured at the cabinet. We're digitizing everything, for efficiency. I looked at the drawer she had open. It was the one labeled 1992-2000. The earliest years. The years before Philip started secondary school, before Danny was old enough to understand what a restaurant required, before we had staff beyond the two of us and one part-time cousin. I see, I said. It'll be much better once it's done, Iris said. Her voice was warm and informative, the voice of someone explaining a beneficial change to someone who might be resistant to change. Everything scanned and backed up, much safer than paper. I nodded. I said, please make sure nothing is removed from the physical files. The originals should stay. A pause, brief but present. Of course, she said. I left again. I went to the front of the restaurant and sat at the corner table, Philip's table, the one we had always kept for family, and I drank tea and watched the lunch service, and thought about what Iris's hands had been doing in that drawer, and what efficiency actually meant when someone used the word to explain why they were alone in a room going through 30-year-old documents. That evening, I called Philip. He answered on the second ring, the way he always had, ever since he was a boy, and had learned that prompt answers were a form of respect. I did not tell him everything. I told him that Danny had been making changes at the restaurant and that I had some questions about the filing system. Philip was quiet for a moment. What kind of changes? I'm not certain yet, I said. I wanted you to know. Another pause. Then, Mom, is everything okay? I'm fine, I said. I'm paying attention. He understood what that meant. He had grown up watching me pay attention. He said he would come down in 3 weeks, for the Lunar New Year gathering we held every year at the restaurant, a tradition that had survived everything, including Vincent's death, and 2 difficult years of thin margins, and 1 health inspection that had required a full kitchen renovation. The gathering had survived all of it. Family as institution. Family as proof of continuity. Good, I said. Come. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. The altar was across the room. The incense had burned down to ash. In the dimness, Vincent's photograph was just a shape, a suggestion of a face I knew better than my own. The filing cabinet drawer. The earliest years. 1992 through 2000. The LLC had been filed in 1998. The EIN letter had arrived in 1994. Both of those documents were in that drawer. Or had been, the last time I checked, which I now understood had been too long ago. I had trusted the restaurant the way you trust a house you have lived in for 30 years, assuming the walls are where you left them, assuming the foundations have not shifted without announcement. I set down my phone. I looked at the tin box on the shelf beside Vincent's photograph. Then I looked away from it, deliberately. The way you look away from something you are not ready to need yet. But I made a note. The kind you don't write down because it doesn't require paper. The kind that settles into the part of the mind that does not forget. Iris had been in that drawer. And she had not expected me to ask which one. I have always kept a copy of the restaurant's annual tax filing in my personal records at home. Vincent started the habit in our second year of business, after a supplier dispute that required us to produce 3 years of income documentation on short notice. He had come home that evening looking older than his age, sat at the kitchen table with his tea going cold beside him, and said, quietly, that a person should never have to depend entirely on one location for proof of what they have built. The next morning he made copies of everything and brought them home in a manila envelope. We had done it every year since. It was one of those small habits that accumulates into infrastructure, unremarkable until the moment it becomes essential. The copy I had at home covered through the previous year. The current year's filing, which Danny had handled for the first time since Vincent's death, I had not yet seen. I asked about it on a Friday morning, standing in the restaurant kitchen before the lunch prep began. Danny was at the pass-through, reviewing that day's inventory. And I asked the way I always asked about administrative matters without preamble, simply and directly, the way you ask about things that have always been yours to ask about. The tax filing, I said. I'd like a copy for my records. He did not look up immediately. That was the first thing I noted. Gerald's office handles all of that now, he said, still looking at the inventory sheet. For efficiency, I can ask him to send you a summary. I don't need a summary, I said. I need a copy. The same copy I've kept every year since 1994. Now he looked up. That smile again, patient, practiced. Mom, it's just paperwork. Gerald's firm has everything organized. It's actually better this way, having a professional handle it. I would like a copy, I said again. He said he would ask Gerald. He said it the way people say they will do something when they have already decided they will not. I went home that afternoon and sat at the desk in the back bedroom, the one Vincent had used for personal correspondence, and I opened the filing drawer where I kept our home copies of the restaurant records. 30 years of annual tax documents in hanging folders, organized by year, labeled in my handwriting. I pulled the most recent one last year's, the final year Vincent had been alive and present for the filing, and laid it on the desk. I read through it the way I had read through every filing, not as an accountant but as a person who understood what the numbers represented because she had lived inside them. Revenue, expenses, payroll, depreciation. The restaurant's financial life rendered in columns. At the top of the first page, in the field marked business owner, 2 names, Vincent Nguyen and Hanh Nguyen. 2 names. As it had always been, I put the document back. I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the desk. Then I opened my laptop, which Philip had set up for me 2 years ago and which I had learned to use with the same methodical patience I had applied to everything else, and I searched for the business registry for our state. The search function was straightforward. I entered the restaurant's name. The result loaded in a few seconds. I read it twice. The registered owner field showed 1 name, Danny Nguyen. There was no date indicating when the change had been made. There was no notation explaining the removal of my name. There was simply the current record, presenting itself as fact, as though it had always been this way, as though the previous 30 years were a draft that had been quietly revised. I closed the laptop. I did not move for several minutes. The room was very still. The ceiling fan turned overhead, and the afternoon light came through the window at the low angle it takes in the weeks before the new year, long and amber, illuminating the dust that floats in old houses that have been lived in long enough to hold everything that has happened inside their walls. I thought about Iris in the filing cabinet drawer. The folders she had been leafing through, the efficiency she had cited. The fractional pause when I asked her to leave the originals. I thought about the tax filing Danny had redirected to Gerald Park's office, the copy he would ask about and not produce. I thought about the meeting in the dining room, the gray-suited attorney who had kept his eyes on his folder, The document Gerald had slid across the table that I had not reached for. I had assumed the meeting was the beginning of Danny's attempt to formalize what he imagined he had already arranged. I now understood it had been a presentation, not a proposal. He had been showing me a conclusion he believed was already established. He had expected me to absorb it, perhaps to grieve it quietly. Perhaps to accept it with the resignation that people sometimes mistake for wisdom in older women. He had not been asking for my agreement. He had been notifying me. I opened the laptop again and searched for the LLC filing documents, the kind that could be amended with the state, the kind that would show a history of changes to ownership structure. The search returned a document with a filing date I had to read 3 times before I fully accepted it. 4 months after Vincent's funeral. Danny had filed the amendment 4 months after we buried his father, while I was still learning to sleep in a house that had 1 fewer person in it. Still waking at 5 in the morning out of habit only to find the other side of the bed empty, still reaching for Vincent's opinion on small decisions the way you reach for a tool that has been moved from its usual place during that time. While I was learning the particular weight of grief, my younger son had gone to an attorney and restructured the business his father and I had built together. I sat with that for a long time. The incense on the altar in the front room had burned to ash while I worked. The light had shifted from amber to the gray-blue of early evening. Outside, the lane was filling with the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night, someone's television, a door closing, a neighbor calling something to someone in a courtyard I couldn't see. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a world that did not know what I had just found and would not have paused for it if it had. I closed the laptop and went to stand at the altar. I lit fresh incense, held the sticks between both hands for a moment the way my mother had taught me, and placed them in the holder. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, thin and white, and I watched it until it dispersed. Then I went to the shelf beside the altar and put my hand on the tin box. I had known, in a general way, that the documents inside were important. I had known this the way you know the value of things you have kept carefully for decades without ever needing them, but I had not yet opened the box since Vincent died. I had treated it as part of the altar, something to be honored rather than used, the way you preserve certain objects, because what they represent matters more than what they contain. I lifted the lid. The EIN confirmation letter was on top, still crisp despite 30 years. The government paper stock holding its weight the way cheap paper never does. Below it, the original LLC operating agreement, folded along lines that had set themselves permanently into the document, the notary's embossed seal visible at the bottom of the signature page. 2 signatures on that page. I looked at the second signature for a long moment. Then I looked at what was printed above it. Then I took out my phone and called Philip. He answered on the second ring. Before he could speak, I said, "Philip, I need you to come sooner." A pause. "Mom, what happened?" "I found something," I said. "In the filing. Danny changed the LLC after your father died." The silence on his end was the particular silence of someone processing something that confirms a fear they had not let themselves fully form. "How bad?" he finally said. "Bad enough," I said, "but I also found something else." "What?" I looked down at the operating agreement in my hand, at the signature line, at the name printed beneath it in clean official type, and at the one detail I had nearly missed, the detail that changed everything, the detail that meant Danny had not been careful enough. "Come as soon as you can," I said. "I'll show you when you're here." Philip arrived on a Sunday. I heard his taxi pull up before I saw it, the particular sound of luggage wheels on the lane's uneven pavement, and I was already at the door by the time he reached the gate. He looked tired in the way that travel tiredness is layered over something else, the kind of tired that begins before the journey. He had not slept well since my phone call. I could see that in his face, in the way he moved through the gate and set down his bag and looked at me with the careful attention of a person who has been worrying at a problem from a distance and is only now close enough to see its actual shape. He hugged me. He smelled like airplane air and the particular soap he had used since his 20s. Some things about our children become fixed so early that we stop registering them as observations, and they become simply part of what we know, the way we know the weight of a familiar cup or the sound of a door we have opened 10,000 times. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. Outside, the lane was quiet in the way. Sunday mornings are quiet, not empty, but unhurried, the neighborhood moving at a different pace than the working week. sounds arriving separately rather than layered. I put the tin box on the table between us. Philip looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Tell me," he said. I told him what I had found in the state registry. The single name where two names had always been. The filing date 4 months after the funeral. I told him about the LLC amendment. The way it had been structured to read as a standard administrative update, the kind of document that could move through a bureaucratic system without triggering scrutiny if the person filing it presented themselves as an authorized representative of the business. Philip's humor, which had been wrapped around his teacup, went still. "He filed as an authorized representative," he said. It was not quite a question. "Gerald Park filed on his behalf," I said. "Danny signed as managing member." "He wasn't the managing member." "No," I said. "He was not." I opened the tin box. I took out the original LLC operating agreement and placed it on the table, open to the signature page. Philip leaned forward and read it with the focused attention he had always brought to documents, to texts, to anything that required precise understanding rather than approximate meaning. A history teacher's habit, the understanding that what is written down is not always what happened, and what happened is not always what is written down, and the distance between the two is where most of the important things occur. He read it twice, then he sat back. "You and Dad are listed as co-managing members with equal ownership," he said. 50-50. "This document requires both signatures for any amendment to ownership structure." "Yes," I said. "Danny filed an amendment without your signature." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. The ceiling fan moved the air slowly above us. From somewhere down the lane, a neighbor's radio was playing something I couldn't identify. The sound arriving in fragments. "Mom," Philip said carefully, "did you sign anything after Dad died? Anything from Gerald Park's office? Anything Danny brought home? Anything that might have been—" "No," I said, "nothing." He picked up the operating agreement again and looked at the signature page. Then he put it down and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion that is worse than they had prepared themselves for. "Then there's a signature somewhere that shouldn't exist," he said. I nodded. I reached into the tin box again and took out the second document I had found during my review of the filing the previous evening. I had not mentioned this on the phone. I had wanted to show it to him in person, to watch his face as he understood what he was looking at, because I needed to know if I was reading it correctly or if grief and anger were distorting my comprehension. It was a photocopy, a copy of the LLC amendment Danny had filed with the state, the same document I had found in the registry, but this version showed the full signature page, which the registry summary had not included. At the bottom of the amendment, in the field marked consent of co-managing member, there was a signature. Hanh Nguyen. Philip stared at it. The signature was wrong. I had known it the moment I saw it the previous evening, in the particular way that you know your own handwriting, the way you know your own face, not through analysis but through a recognition so immediate it requires no thought. The letters were shaped correctly, the name was spelled correctly, but the motion behind it was wrong. My signature has a characteristic in the H, a slight leftward pull at the base of the first stroke, that I developed in my 20s, and that has never changed. This signature was smooth where mine was not. Even. Someone had copied the form of the letters, without understanding the habit behind them. Someone had copied it from somewhere. Philip set the document down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you are not certain will hold its shape. "Where did you get this?" he said. "It came in the folder Gerald Park's office sent last month," I said. "The one Danny said was routine administrative documentation. I put it in the filing drawer without reading it carefully. I went back through it after I found the registry entry." Philip looked at the signature again, then at me. "This is forgery," he said. "Yes," I said. The words sat between us in the kitchen. Outside, the neighbor's radio played its distant fragments. The ceiling fan turned. The incense on the altar in the front room had burned down to a thin line of smoke that barely moved in the still air. I thought about Iris standing at the filing cabinet in the office at the back of the restaurant, leafing through the folders labeled 1992 through 2000, her efficiency careful and purposeful. I thought about what she had been looking for, and what she might have found. I thought about the EIN letter from 1000, 994, still in the tin box, the one that bore my signature in full, the original, the one that showed exactly how Hanh Nguyen had signed her name in 1994 and how she had been signing it ever since. The same signature they had copied, the original from which they had made their copy. Philip was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling a lawyer tonight," he said. "Not Gerald Park's office, someone independent. I know someone in the city, a business attorney who handled a case for the school district 2 years ago. She's good." "Yes," I said. "Call her." He dialed. I sat with my hands around my teacup, which had gone cold while we talked, and looked at the forgery on the table, at the smooth impersonation of my name, at someone's careful, insufficient attempt to become me on paper. I thought about what Iris had been searching for in that drawer. The efficiency she had cited, the originals she had promised to preserve. And then I thought about the one thing I had not yet told Philip. The thing I had found at the very bottom of the folder from Gerald Park's office, beneath the amendment, beneath the routine administrative papers, tucked inside a plain white envelope that bore no label. A letter, addressed to Danny from Gerald Park. Dated 11 months ago, 3 months before the amendment was filed. I had read it 4 times. I had not yet told Philip what it said, because telling him meant making it full of goofily real. And I had needed one more night with the weight of it before I passed it to someone else to carry. Philip ended his call and looked at me. "She can see us Tuesday morning," he said. "Mom, is there anything else?" I reached into the tin box one final time and took out the white envelope. "Yes," I said. "There is one more thing." I slid it across the table and watched my son's face as he opened it and began to read. The attorney's name was Margaret Soon. Philip had described her as precise and unhurried, which turned out to be accurate in the way that descriptions of capable people often understate the thing that makes them capable. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses she removed when she was thinking and replaced when she was reading, and she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades listening to other people's worst news and have learned not to perform a reaction when they need to be thinking instead. We met in her office on a Tuesday morning. Philip and I sat across from her, with the tin box on the table between us. I had brought everything, the EIN letter, the original operating agreement, the amendment with the forged signature, and the letter from Gerald Park that I had not yet described aloud to anyone except Philip, because reading it had required a kind of composure I needed to build before I could use it. Margaret read each document in the order I presented them. She did not ask questions while she read. She made 2 small notes on her legal pad, both of which she wrote without looking up from the documents. When she finished, she removed her glasses and looked at me. "The forged signature is the center of this," she said. "Everything else, the registry amendment, the LLC restructuring, the removal of your name from the operating business, it all depends on that signature being valid. It isn't. That means the amendment was filed fraudulently, which means the current ownership structure has no legal standing." "Can it be reversed?" Philip asked. "With this documentation?" She tapped the EIN letter. "Yes. The original agreement establishes your mother as co-managing member with equal ownership. The EIN filing confirms her as co-founder. The forged consent is provably inconsistent with her actual signature on record. A forensic document examiner could confirm it in an afternoon, but honestly, a judge would see it without expert testimony." She put her glasses back on and looked at the letter from Gerald Park. "This is the more complicated matter," she said. The letter. I had read it so many times that I could recite it from memory, though I did not want to. Gerald Park had written to Danny 11 months ago, 3 months before the amendment was filed. The language was careful, professionally constructed, the kind of prose that has been shaped to be deniable while still communicating exactly what it intends. But the meaning was clear. Gerald had advised Danny that the operating agreement required both co-managing members' consent for any ownership amendment. He had noted that one co-managing member, me, was, in his phrasing, unlikely to provide voluntary consent given the circumstances. He had then outlined, across 2 careful paragraphs, the process by which such consent could be documented. He had not used the word forgery. He had not needed to. Margaret looked at me over her glasses. "You understand what this letter establishes?" "Yes," I said. "Your son's attorney advised him that obtaining your signature involuntarily was the path forward." and then proceeded to file documentation containing a signature that is not yours. She set the letter down. That is conspiracy to commit fraud. It is a different category of problem than the forgery itself. Philip was very still beside me. I had known, since reading the letter the first time, that this was what it meant. I had sat with that knowledge for 4 days before Philip arrived, carrying it through the ordinary motions of the week, lighting incense in the morning, making tea, walking to the market, cooking the things I had always cooked. I had carried it the way you carry something very heavy, by not stopping to feel the weight, just continuing to move, because stopping is the thing that makes the weight unbearable. What do we do now? Philip said. Margaret folded her hands on the desk. We build the case carefully, and we do it quietly. I don't want Danny or his attorney to know we've consulted legal counsel until we're ready to move. Do you have access to the restaurant's financial records? The business accounts? I have home copies of all filings through last year, I said. This year's filing I haven't been able to obtain. Danny redirected all documentation to Gerald Park's office. That itself is notable, she said. A co-managing member being denied access to business records is a separate, actionable matter. She made another note. I'm going to need 2 things from you. First, a written account of every attempt you've made to access restaurant records since your husband's death, with dates. Second, if you can obtain any additional documentation from the restaurant itself without raising suspicion, do it carefully and keep it at home. I told her about the filing cabinet in the back office. The drawer labeled 1992 through 2000. Iris's hands moving through it with her particular efficiency. Margaret's expression did not change, but something shifted slightly in her eyes, the look of someone adding a piece to a picture they are assembling. If original documents have been removed from those files, that's destruction of business records. Document what's missing if you can determine it. We left an hour later. On the pavement outside Margaret's building, Philip stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of winter morning that feels like a held breath before something changes. How are you? He asked. I'm working, I said. He looked at me. He nodded. My mother used to say that still water runs deepest. She said it when she meant that the people who said least were the ones carrying the most, and that the ones carrying the most were the ones who ultimately moved things. I had thought of it in the dining room the night of Danny's announcement. I thought of it again now, standing outside Margaret Soong's office with my son beside me and the tin box under my arm. Still water, the kind that holds its surface while moving underneath. I returned to the restaurant the following morning and moved through the day as I always had. I spoke with Mai about the lunch menu. I walked the dining room before opening, checking the tables the way I had checked them for 30 years, adjusting a setting here, straightening a chair there. Danny arrived mid-morning and passed through without lingering. Iris was not there. In the afternoon, when the restaurant was between services and the office was empty, I went to the filing cabinet. I did not rush. I opened the drawer labeled 1992 through 2000 and went through it methodically, the way you go through something when you need to know exactly what is there and exactly what is not. The folders were still organized in the system I had established 30 years ago. Most were intact. The folder for 1998 was thinner than it should have been. I knew what had been in it. The LLC formation documents, the original operating agreement before we had moved the notarized copy to the tin box at home, correspondence with the filing office, the first amendment we had made in 2001 to update our registered address, standard material, proof of the business's origins. The folder now contained only the address amendment from 2001, everything from the filing year itself gone. I stood at the cabinet for a moment, holding the thin folder. The kitchen sounds moved through the wall behind me, the familiar rhythm of preparation, the sounds I had listened to for 30 years and would be listening to still if no one had decided that my name was removable. I took out my phone and photographed the folder, open and empty of what it should have contained. Then I replaced it exactly as I had found it, closed the drawer, and left the office. On my way through the dining room, I stopped at the corner table, Philip's table, the family table. I looked at it for a moment the way you look at things that contain a long history in a small space. Then I noticed something I had not seen before. Under the edge of the table, near the wall side, Someone had taped a small white envelope. Fresh tape, recently applied, the edges had not yellowed at all. It was the kind of placement that would be invisible unless you were standing at exactly this angle in exactly this light. I did not reach for it immediately. I looked around the dining room, empty. The kitchen sounds continued undisturbed. I peeled the envelope from the table and slipped it into my pocket without opening it. Walked to the restroom at the back of the restaurant. Locked the door. And opened it there. Inside was a single folded page, no signature, printed text, not handwritten, 8 lines. The first line read, "I have worked here for 11 years. I know what was taken from that cabinet." The last line read, "There is a second set of documents. Iris made copies before she took the originals. I know where she keeps them." The notice arrived on a Wednesday, not delivered by hand, not sent through Margaret's office, not preceded by a phone call or a conversation or any of the ordinary courtesies that exist between people who share a history. It arrived by certified mail, addressed to me at the house on the lane, in an envelope bearing Gerald Park's firm name in the upper left corner. The postal carrier knocked at 8 in the morning. I signed for it at the door in my house slippers, holding my tea, and I stood in the doorway and read it before I had finished my first cup. The letter informed me that as I was no longer a registered co-managing member of the LLC, my continued presence at the restaurant in any operational capacity constituted unauthorized access to a private business. Effective immediately, I was asked to refrain from entering the kitchen, the office, or any non-public area of the restaurant. I was welcome to visit as a customer during regular business hours. Any personal items I had left on the premises would be boxed and available for collection at the front entrance at my convenience. Personal items. 30 years of my life, reduced to a box at the front entrance. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and placed it on the kitchen table beside my tea, and I finished my tea standing at the window, watching the lane. I called Philip. He called Margaret. Margaret called me back within the hour, and told me not to go to the restaurant that day, to let her respond to Gerald Park's office first, to give her until Friday before I did anything. Her voice was steady in the way that competent people's voices are steady, when the situation is serious, not minimizing, just contained. I agreed. I hung up. I lit the morning incense, and stood at the altar for a long time. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I went to the restaurant anyway. Not to the kitchen, not to the office. I went as a customer, exactly as Gerald Park's letter had permitted, and I sat at the corner table, Philip's table, the family table, and I ordered tea from a young server named Bin, who had been with us for 2 years, and who brought the tea with both hands and a slight bow, the way I had taught all the staff to serve, the way Vincent had said made customers feel like guests rather than transactions. I sat there for 2 hours during the lunch service. I watched the dining room the way I had watched it for 30 years, the tables filling and emptying, Mai's kitchen running with the rhythm I had helped establish, the sounds coming through the pass-through in the familiar pattern of a service that knew itself. The restaurant did not need Danny to function. It ran on 30 years of habit and training and the accumulated knowledge of people who had learned their work here. Danny arrived at 12:30. He came through the front door rather than the kitchen entrance, which meant he had been told I was there. He was dressed more formally than usual, jacket, collared shirt, the clothing of someone who had decided the day required a particular presentation of authority. Iris was with him. She walked a half step behind and to his left, her posture arranged into something that resembled support, but was actually observation. She was watching the room, watching the staff, watching me. Danny stopped at my table. "Mom." He said it with a patience that was not patience at all, but its performance. "You got Gerald's letter." "I did," I said. "Then you know that you're not." "I'm a customer," I said. "Gerald's letter said I'm welcome as a customer. I'm having tea." He looked at the teacup. He looked at me. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, the way you control a reaction when you have an audience and you know the audience is watching. "We should talk," he said, privately. "I'm comfortable here," I said. Iris touched his arm, a small gesture, deliberate. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat. She remained standing just behind his left shoulder, and I understood that this had been arranged, the positioning, the timing, the jacket and collared shirt. They had discussed how this conversation would go. "I know this is hard," Danny said. His voice had shifted into a register I recognized from his adolescence, the tone he had used when he wanted something and had decided that the most efficient path was a version of sympathy. "Dad's gone. The business needs to move forward, and I know that's painful for you. But the restaurant has to be run professionally now. Properly structured. Gerald's firm has helped us set up the right framework." "The framework you filed 4 months after your father's funeral," I said. A brief stillness. "The transition needed to happen. Without my signature," I said. "Mom," he leaned forward slightly. "Your signature is on the amendment. Gerald has the documentation." I looked at him. He held my gaze with the confidence of someone who believes the paperwork is settled, and that settled paperwork is the same as settled truth. "All right," I said. He blinked. He had expected argument. Tears, perhaps. The way people who have underestimated you always expect the reaction that would make them comfortable. He recalibrated quickly. "I'm glad you understand. The restaurant will always be your home. You can visit whenever you want. We'll make sure you're taken care of." "That's very kind," I said. Iris was watching me. She had not stopped watching me since they arrived. She was more careful than Danny, more attuned to the things that didn't fit the expected pattern. My agreement was a thing that didn't fit. She knew it. I could see her knowing it. Danny stood. He straightened his jacket. He had the look of a man who has just concluded something successfully, who will go home that evening and feel the particular satisfaction of a problem resolved. "I'll have Gerald's office follow up about any remaining administrative questions. We want this to be smooth, for everyone." He put his hand on my shoulder as he turned to leave. A brief proprietary pat, the gesture of someone who has already decided the matter is finished. I said nothing. I watched him walk back through the dining room, nodding to the staff as he passed. Iris following. Both of them moving with the ease of people who own what they are walking through. He stopped at the pass-through and said something to Mai. Mai looked back at me for just a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. I sat with my tea until it went cold. Around me, the lunch service continued. Tables turned. The familiar sounds moved through the room. Bin came by to ask if I needed anything and I said no, thank you, and he nodded with both hands clasped, the way I had taught, and moved away. I was looking at the spot under the table where the envelope had been taped. The tape marks were still visible if you knew where to look. 2 small pale rectangles on the underside of the table edge, clean and recent. I thought about what the letter had said. A second set of documents. Copies Iris had made before she took the originals. 11 years, the note had said. The person who wrote it had worked here for 11 years. I had been going through the staff in my mind since I found it. Narrowing by tenure, by access, by the quality of attention required to notice what Iris had done in that filing cabinet. There were 3 people it could be. I thought about the way Mai had looked at me just now, over Danny's shoulder, before turning back to the stove. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds I recognized something in it, not fear, not sympathy, but the specific expression of a person who is carrying information and waiting to know whether the time to give it has arrived. I placed enough money on the table for the tea and a tip that was more than the tea cost, the way I had always done for staff who served well. Then I went home to wait for the time to arrive. It came sooner than I expected. My phone buzzed before I reached the end of the lane. A message from a number I didn't recognize, 6 words only. Tonight. Back gate. After closing. Come alone. Mai was already at the back gate when I arrived. She was standing in the narrow alley behind the restaurant, in the space between the kitchen's rear door and the concrete wall that separated the property from the lane behind it. A single bulb above the door cast light that went only so far, beyond its reach. The alley was dark in the way that alleys are dark in this part of the city, not empty dark, but inhabited dark, the kind that holds the sounds of other people's evenings at a distance. She was holding a canvas bag against her chest with both hands. 11 years. I had hired Mai in the autumn of the year Philip moved to Portland. She had come in response to a handwritten notice I had posted on the community board at the market, because Vincent had said that people who find work through community boards are people who still pay attention to their neighborhoods, and those were the people he wanted in his kitchen. She had been 28 then. She had learned everything she knew about running a professional kitchen inside these walls. She looked at me now the way people look when they have been carrying something that has become too heavy to carry alone. "I'm sorry it took me this long," she said. "You're here," I said. "That's what matters." She handed me the canvas bag. Inside was a manila envelope, thick, sealed with the kind of heavy clasp that office supply stores sell for documents you mean to keep. She watched me take it out, watched my hands on it. "Iris left her laptop open in the office 3 weeks ago," Mai said. "She went to take a phone call in the dining room. I wasn't trying to see I was dropping off the invoices from the morning delivery, the way I do every week." The screen was open to her email. I waited. She was writing to her sister, Mai said. It was long. I didn't read all of it. I read enough. She paused. I took a photograph of the screen. I didn't know if I should. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But I knew I couldn't unknow what I had just read. I opened the envelope. The contents were ordered carefully. The way Mai ran her kitchen, nothing wasted, everything in its proper place. On top was the photograph she had taken of Iris's laptop screen, printed on plain paper, clear enough to read every line. Below it, a set of photocopied documents, crisp and complete. I read the email first. Iris had written to her sister in the casual, unguarded way that people write when they believe they are in a private conversation, the kind of writing that exists in the space between thought and speech, where the careful self steps aside and the actual self takes over. She had used no formal language. She had not been constructing a narrative. She had been telling her sister what had happened and how it had worked and what came next. I will not reproduce every line here, because some of what she wrote is still too raw to handle in its original form. The way certain materials require protective covering before you can carry them. But the substance of it was this. The plan had begun before Vincent died. Not weeks before. Months. Iris had begun researching the LLC structure 14 months before Vincent's death, during the period when his illness had become serious enough that the question of the restaurant's future had entered the space between her and Danny in a way that did not leave. She had identified the co-managing member requirement. She had identified the consent clause. She had identified Gerald Park, who had handled 2 similar cases for other clients, and who had charged accordingly for his particular understanding of how documents could be structured. She had found the original EIN letter in the restaurant files during a visit 2 years ago, at a family dinner, when she had excused herself to use the restroom and instead spent 12 minutes in the back office with the filing cabinet open. She had photographed my signature. I stood in the alley light and read that sentence 3 times. She had photographed my signature from a government document that Vincent's hands had filed, that bore my name because I had been present at the founding of this business. Because I had been half of what built it, because 30 years ago a woman and her husband had walked into a room that smelled like motor oil and the previous tenant's regrets, and had decided together that it was possible, that they had done harder things, that they would do this too. She had photographed my signature, and she had practiced it. The email said this. She had written it to her sister without apparent discomfort, the way people describe practical preparations, the steps of a plan that had been thought through carefully and was proceeding as designed. She had written, "It took me about 2 weeks to get the motion right. The thing with the H is tricky, but I figured it out. The thing with the H, my mother had taught me to write. She had sat beside me at the kitchen table when I was 7 years old and guided my hand through each letter, and the H had come last because the double vertical strokes required a consistency of pressure she said I had to learn to feel rather than see. The leftward pull at the base of the first stroke was something I had developed in my 20s and had never corrected because Vincent said it was distinctive, that he could recognize my signature from across a room, that it looked like nobody else in the world. Iris had spent 2 weeks figuring it out. I became aware that my hands were shaking. Not from fear, not from cold. From the particular physical response of a body that has just absorbed something that exceeds its immediate capacity to process the kind of thing that moves through you like a current, finding every nerve on its way. I set the photograph down carefully and looked at the documents beneath it. They were the copies Mai had mentioned in her note. Iris's copies, made before she removed the originals from the 1998 folder. The LLC formation documents, the original operating agreement before the notarized version was moved home, the correspondence from the filing office. everything that had been taken from that drawer, and at the bottom, one document I had not expected to find. A handwritten note on restaurant letterhead, dated 8 months before Vincent died, written in Vincent's handwriting, which I knew as well as I knew my own, the careful, slightly forward-leaning script of a man who had learned to write in difficult circumstances and had always treated the act of writing as something that deserved attention. The note was addressed to both of us, to Han and to our sons. It was the kind of note a person writes when they understand that time is becoming finite and there are things that should be said clearly while saying them is still possible. Vincent had written it to establish, in his own words, the history of the restaurant, who had built it, how, at what cost, with whose labor and savings and sacrifice. He had listed things I had never heard him put into words before: the nights I had worked after he went to sleep, the decisions I had made that he had not known how to make, the way I had built the staff culture that made the kitchen function with a steadiness that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with me. He had written, "This restaurant belongs to both of us equally, and after I am gone it belongs to Han first, because she was there first, in the ways that matter most." The note had been in the 1998 folder. Iris had found it and kept it with her copies. She had kept it, and she had said nothing, and she had watched Danny present Gerald Park's documents in the dining room, while this note existed in a canvas bag in Mai's kitchen locker. I stood in the alley for a long time. The single bulb above the kitchen door burned steadily. The sounds of the neighborhood came and went. Mai stood a few feet away, not speaking, giving me the space that the moment required. I thought about Vincent at 5 in the morning with his tea going cold on the counter. I thought about the napkin sketch that had worn soft at the folds. I thought about the red paint that was wrong and the red paint that was right, and the 30 years of mornings that had followed that second weekend, the 30 years of labor that had somehow been reducible, in Iris's email to her sister, to a signature that took 2 weeks to practice. He had written, "She was there first, in the ways that matter most." I folded the note along its creases and placed it back in the envelope with everything else, and I closed the clasp, and I held the envelope against my chest with both hands the way Mai had held the bag when I arrived. I looked at her. "Does anyone else know you have these?" I said. "No," she said. "Good," I said. "Keep it that way until I tell you otherwise." She nodded. Then she said, quietly, "He was a good man, Mrs. Nguyen. He talked about you when he was in the kitchen. Not often. But the things he said—" I could not speak for a moment. "I know," I said when I could. I walked home through the dark lane, with Vincent's note pressed against my heart, and I did not cry until I was inside with the door closed and the incense lit, and then I cried for a long time, not from defeat but from the unbearable tenderness of being known, fully and completely, by someone who was no longer there to see what was being done with that knowledge. When I finished, I washed my face and opened my phone and sent Margaret Soong a single message. "I have everything. When can we meet?" Margaret Soong's office had a particular quality of light in the morning. It came through the east-facing window at an angle that fell across the conference table without glare, the kind of light that made documents easy to read and expressions easy to see. I had noticed this at our first meeting. I noticed it again now, sitting across from her with the canvas bag on the table between us and Philip to my left. His hands flat on the table, the way they had been flat on the table the night of Danny's announcement, that posture of contained readiness. Margaret read Vincent's note last. She read it slowly, which I appreciated. Some documents deserve to be read slowly. When she finished, she set it down with the same care she had given to the EIN letter, the same care she gave to all things that represented what people had built and what had been done to what they had built. She removed her glasses. "This changes the weight of the case," she said. "Not the legal structure. The original operating agreement and the forged signature were already sufficient, but this establishes intent. Your husband's documented wishes regarding ownership succession. A court doesn't need this to rule in your favor, but it will want to consider it." "And Gerald Park's involvement?" Philip said. "The letter from his office to Danny, advising on the consent process." She tapped it. "That is the piece I will be sending to the state bar, separately from the civil matter. What Gerald Park did is a licensing issue as well as a legal one." She looked at me. "I want you to understand what we're building here. This is not a quick resolution. Filing the revocation of the fraudulent amendment, the civil claim against Danny and Iris for document fraud, the bar complaint against Gerald Park, these run on different timelines. What I can do quickly is file an emergency injunction to freeze any further changes to the business structure and restore your documented access to the restaurant's records and premises. How quickly? Philip asked. End of the week, if I work tonight. She said it without drama, as a simple fact about what she intended to do. I thought about the shape of the week ahead. Danny and Iris moving through the restaurant with the ease of people who believe the matter is finished. Gerald Park at his desk in the glass tower on Central Avenue, probably already thinking about the next client. The filing cabinet drawer, thinner than it should be, holding its absence quietly. There is one more thing I need, Margaret said. She looked at me directly. The person who gave you these documents. I'll need a signed statement from her about the circumstances under which she obtained the photograph of the email. Her account needs to be on record. I'll ask her, I said. She may be reluctant. She still works there. I know, I said. I'll ask her. I returned to the restaurant the following morning as a customer, as Gerald Park's letter had specified. I sat at the corner table. I ordered tea. I waited until the lunch rush had passed and the dining room had emptied to its quiet mid-afternoon state, the tables reset and waiting, the kitchen running on the lower frequency of preparation for the evening service. Mai came out of the kitchen at 3:15, as she always did, to check the front of house before the dinner prep began in earnest. 11 years of the same routine. She moved through the dining room with the unhurried attention of someone who knows the room well enough to see what is wrong with it at a glance, straightening what needed straightening, noting what needed restocking. She stopped at my table. I did not say anything elaborate. I told her what Margaret had said about the statement, and I told her what it would mean her name on a legal document, her account of what she had seen made official. I told her she should take time to consider it. I told her I would not think less of her if she decided the risk was too great. She looked at me for a long moment. Behind her, through the pass-through window, I could hear the kitchen sounds. The sounds she had listened to for 11 years. The sounds I had helped build into a rhythm that ran without needing to be supervised, because the people who worked inside it had been trained well and had stayed because the place was worth staying in. I'll sign it, she said. Tell me when and where. I nodded. She went back to the kitchen. At home that evening, I spread everything across Vincent's desk in the back bedroom. The tin box opened beside me, every document in its own place, ordered by date and significance, the way I had always organized the things that mattered. I had been an orderly person my whole life, not from temperament alone but from understanding, learned early, that disorder is a form of vulnerability. Things that are organized can be found. Things that can be found can be used. Things that can be used can protect you. I made a list on a plain sheet of paper. EIN confirmation letter, 1994. 2 original signatures. Government seal, filed copy retained at home. LLC operating agreement, 1998. Notarized. Co-managing members listed with equal ownership. Consent clause requiring both signatures for amendments. Gerald Park's letter to Danny, dated 11 months prior. Advising on consent acquisition, specific in its implications. Preserved in original. Forged amendment. Hanh Nguyen signature, demonstrably inconsistent with original, filed with state registry 4 months after Vincent's death. Iris's email, photographed by Mai. Detailing the timeline of the plan, the signature research, the 2 weeks of practice, admitted in her own words to a person she believed was her sister in a private conversation, copies of removed documents made by Iris before taking originals. Evidence of deliberate destruction of business records. Vincent's handwritten note, establishing his own account of ownership and intent, dated and signed in his hand. I read the list through twice, then I folded it and placed it in the tin box, on top of everything else, and closed the lid. I sat for a while in the quiet of the back bedroom. The house was still around me. The altar in the front room, the incense long burned out for the day, the amber light of the desk lamp making the room feel smaller and warmer than its actual dimensions. The sounds from the lane outside, ordinary and unhurried, entirely indifferent to what was being assembled at this desk. I thought about what Margaret had said. Not a quick resolution, different timelines. The machinery of official process, slow and thorough and impersonal, would take the things I had gathered and move them through its own rhythm. That was all right. I had learned to work inside other rhythms than my own. I had also learned, in 30 years of running a kitchen and a business, and a household and a life alongside another person and then without that person, that preparation is not the same as waiting. Waiting is passive. Preparation is a form of motion that looks still from the outside. It requires the same attention as action, the same sustained focus, the same willingness to hold discomfort in the body while the mind does what the moment requires. I had been preparing since the night of Danny's announcement, perhaps longer. Philip called at 9 that evening. He was flying back to Portland in 2 days, returning to his school, his students, his life in the city 3 hours north. He would come back when Margaret needed him. Until then, he would be reachable, attentive, present in the way that a person can be present from a distance when they have decided that nothing else takes priority. We talked for 40 minutes, not about documents or legal timelines or the specific choreography of what was coming. We talked about his father, about the napkin sketch, about the Sunday we painted the dining room the wrong red, and the following Sunday when we painted it the right one. Small things. The kind of small things that turn out to be the structure of a life when you look back at them from sufficient distance. Before he hung up, he said, "Are you ready?" I looked at the tin box on Vincent's desk. "Yes," I said. I was more than ready. I had been gathering and organizing and waiting for the right moment, with the patience of someone who understood that timing was not an accident but a choice, and I had chosen mine carefully, and in 3 days' time I would walk into a room that Danny believed belonged entirely to him, and I would place a tin box on the table, and the room would become something different than it had been when I entered it. The only question that remained was whether Danny would understand what was happening before it was too late to understand anything at all. He would not. I had made certain of that. Margaret had chosen the room herself. Not a courtroom, not yet, that would come later. In the slower machinery of civil proceedings and bar complaints and whatever remained of Gerald Park's professional reputation once the state bar finished its review. This was a preliminary hearing, a procedural meeting called to address the emergency injunction Margaret had filed 4 days earlier. The purpose, on paper, was to determine whether the fraudulent amendment should be suspended pending full investigation. The location was a conference room in a downtown building that housed several legal offices. Neutral ground, Margaret had said. Large enough for all parties. I arrived 15 minutes early. The room had a long table, 8 chairs, windows facing east. The morning light I had come to associate with Margaret's office. I set the tin box on the table in front of me and folded my hands and waited. Philip sat to my left, Margaret to my right, her legal pad already open, her reading glasses on, 2 pens aligned parallel beside the pad. Mai was in the hallway outside, seated on a bench with her signed statement in an envelope in her lap, waiting to be called in if needed. She had arrived before any of us, dressed in the careful way of someone who understands the weight of the occasion. Danny and Iris arrived together at 5 minutes past the hour. Danny was in his formal jacket again. Iris wore a structured blazer in a neutral color, her posture composed, her expression arranged into something that suggested she found the proceeding mildly inconvenient but entirely manageable. Gerald Park came in behind them, his gray suit identical in effect if not fabric to every other gray suit I had seen him wear, his folder under his arm, his eyes doing their quick professional survey of the room before he sat down. A mediator, appointed by the court to oversee the preliminary hearing, sat at the head of the table. Her name was Judge Retired Linda Farrow. She had been introduced to us in the hallway before we entered. Silver-haired, reading glasses on a lanyard. The particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have presided over a great many rooms and have stopped wasting energy on anything the room doesn't require. And there was one more person at the table. Carol Brennan had driven in from her regional office that morning. She was in her early 60s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the institutional bearing of someone who has spent 30 years inside federal bureaucracy and has learned to carry that weight without letting it show. She had been the Small Business Administration officer who processed our EIN application in 1994. Margaret had located her through official channels 2 weeks ago. She had reviewed the original filing at Margaret's request and had agreed without hesitation to appear. Danny looked at Carol Brennan with the expression of someone encountering a variable they had not accounted for. Good. The mediator opened the session. She outlined the purpose review of the emergency injunction, examination of the disputed amendment, determination of whether suspension was warranted pending civil proceedings. Standard procedural language, efficient and impersonal. Gerald Park nodded along with the practiced patience of an attorney who believes the proceedings are a formality. Margaret presented first. She laid out the timeline without embellishment, in the plain sequential language of someone who understands that facts, properly ordered, require no ornamentation. The original LLC filing, the operating agreement, the co-managing member clause, the death of one founding member, the amendment filed 4 months later, the name removed, the name remaining. She placed the forged amendment on the table. The amendment includes a consent signature attributed to my client, Hanh Nguyen, Margaret said. We will demonstrate that this signature was not produced by my client. Gerald Park said, in the measured tone of someone who is prepared for this. The documentation was filed through standard legal channels. The consent was obtained. Miss Brennan, Margaret said, addressing Carol directly. Could you describe the document you reviewed at my request? Carol opened her folder. She took out a single page, a photocopy of the original EIN confirmation letter. The one I had kept in the tin box since 1994. She placed it flat on the table where everyone could see it. I processed this application in February of 1994, she said. I remember the filing because it was one of 3 co-founder applications I processed that week, and it was notable because both founders were present in person, which was not always the case. I witnessed both signatures. She touched the photocopy. This is Hanh Nguyen's original signature as I witnessed it. She took out a second page. The forged consent from Danny's amendment, printed at the same scale. This is the signature filed with the state registry as Hanh Nguyen's consent to the ownership amendment. She placed them side by side. The room was quiet. The 2 signatures were visible to everyone at the table, even from where Danny sat, 3 chairs away. The difference was legible. My signature, the one I had been writing for 30 years, with the leftward pull at the base of the first stroke of the H that Vincent had said, looked like nobody else in the world, and the smooth, practiced, almost correct version that had taken someone 2 weeks to produce. Almost correct. Not correct. I have 30 years of experience reviewing signed federal documents, Carol said. These signatures were not produced by the same person. Gerald Park's folder was very still on the table in front of him. Margaret placed the second document on the table. Gerald Park's letter to Danny, advising on the consent acquisition process. She did not read it aloud. She did not need to. The mediator picked it up, read it, set it down. The mediator looked at Gerald Park. Gerald Park looked at the letter. Danny looked at nothing in particular, his gaze directed at a point on the table's surface that had become suddenly absorbing. Iris had stopped performing composure. She was sitting very still, her hands in her lap, her face doing the work of a person who is rapidly recalculating a situation that has moved outside the boundaries of what they planned for. Margaret placed the third document on the table. Iris's email, printed from Mai's photograph of the laptop screen. The mediator read it in silence. When she finished, she looked up, and in the look was the particular quality of a person who has just been shown something that changes the character of everything that came before it. I had not spoken yet. I had sat at this table in silence while Margaret presented, while Carol testified. While the documents did the work that 30 years of careful preservation had made possible, I had sat the way. I had sat in the dining room the night of Danny's announcement, hands folded, back straight. Expression arranged into the same slight, one-sided calm that had unsettled my son then, and that I understood now, was the most accurate expression of what I actually felt. I was not angry. I was finished. The mediator asked if I wished to make a statement before she issued her preliminary ruling. I looked at Danny. He was looking at the table. He had not met my eyes since he walked into the room. Beside him, Iris was a careful stillness that had gone beyond composure into something that resembled shock, the particular shock of people who have constructed a reality and are watching it disassemble in real time. I thought about what Danny had said in the dining room. The voice he had used, flat and informative, reading off a verdict like a menu item. Mom, you were just the cook. Your name was never on anything that mattered. I reached into the tin box. I took out Vincent's handwritten note, the one he had written 8 months before he died, the one that had been sitting in a filing cabinet in the restaurant while Danny stood in the dining room and told me my name had never been on anything that mattered. I placed it on the table. I smoothed it flat with both hands. My husband wrote this, I said. He wrote it 8 months before he died. When he understood that time was becoming finite and he wanted certain things to be clear. I looked at the note, not at Danny. He wrote that the restaurant belongs to both of us equally. He wrote that after he was gone, it belongs to me first. He wrote, I paused, because the next words required the same steadiness as everything else, the same surface that gives nothing away while everything moves underneath. He wrote that I was there first, in the ways that matter most. I looked at Danny then, directly, without heat, without performance, without the anger that would have been understandable and that I had decided, somewhere in the weeks of preparation, would cost me more than it was worth. I cooked every dish on that first menu, I said. I wrote the recipes. I hired the staff. I kept the books. I chose the suppliers. I trained the kitchen. Your father and I built that restaurant together for 30 years, and there was never a single day of those 30 years when my name was not on anything that mattered. The room was very quiet. The mediator looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. I'm suspending the amendment, effective immediately, she said, and I'm recommending this matter for full civil proceedings. Mr. Park, I'd suggest you consult your own legal counsel before we proceed further. Gerald Park did not respond. Outside the windows, the morning light fell across the table in the same steady, unhurried way it always had, indifferent to the particular weight of what had just shifted inside the room. I put Vincent's note back in the tin box, and I closed the lid, and I left my hands resting on top of it. It was enough. For now, it was exactly enough. The civil proceedings moved on their own timeline, as Margaret had said they would. But the collapse of Danny and Iris happened faster than any court schedule. It began the afternoon of the preliminary hearing, in the parking garage beneath the downtown building, where Danny and Iris had a conversation that 3 people overheard because neither of them had thought to check whether the concrete columns in a parking garage carry sound in unexpected directions. One of those 3 people was Margaret's paralegal, who had gone to retrieve Margaret's car. She described it to Margaret that evening with the careful precision of someone who understands that what they witnessed was significant. Margaret described it to me the following morning. Danny had said, in the flat voice of someone whose control had slipped past its edge. You told me the signature was clean. You told me no one would be able to tell, Iris had said. It was clean. There was no way to know she kept the original somewhere else. Danny had said, Gerald told us the same thing, that the original filing would be the only comparison point. That's what we paid him for. Iris had said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, Gerald's problem is Gerald's problem now. Danny had said, Gerald's problem is our problem. He was acting on our behalf. That's conspiracy. Iris. That's not a civil matter. Another silence. Then Iris, very quietly, I need to call my lawyer. Not their lawyer, her lawyer. Margaret told me this over the phone. Her voice carrying the particular evenness of a person delivering information they know will land hard. When she said my lawyer, that was the marriage ending in real time. In a parking garage? I was standing at the kitchen window when she told me. The lane outside was going about its morning, entirely indifferent as always. I held the phone and looked at a neighbor's potted plant on the opposite wall, a small stubborn thing that had been flowering in the same spot for as long as I could remember. What happens now? I said. Gerald Park submitted his resignation to his firm this morning, Margaret said, before they could ask for it. The bar complaint is separate from that, and it will proceed regardless. Danny and Iris have retained separate attorneys, which means they will almost certainly negotiate against each other before this reaches a full trial. People who commit fraud together rarely stay loyal once the structure fails. She was right about that. The timeline of the following 2 weeks arrived to me in pieces, through Margaret, through Philip, through the slow return of information that flows back toward the person at the center of a situation once that situation begins to resolve. Iris's attorney contacted Margaret's office first. The framing was cooperative. His client wished to provide a full account of the events leading to the fraudulent filing in exchange for consideration in the civil proceedings. The account Iris provided was comprehensive. It covered the timeline she had described to her sister in the email, but in considerably more detail. The 14 months of research. The filing cabinet in the restaurant. The photograph of the signature. The 2 weeks of practice. Gerald Park's involvement from the beginning, his specific advice about the consent clause, his assurance that the original EIN filing would never be located, his assurance that I would not have kept it. Margaret read me this section over the phone, and I held it for a moment before I responded. He assumed I wasn't organized, I said. He assumed you were a retired woman in her late 60s who had recently lost her husband and would not have the documentation in order, Margaret said. He was wrong about all of it. He was wrong because Vincent had been right. About the tin box. About the nature of things that outlast their makers. About what it means to build something carefully enough that it holds. Danny's attorney took longer to reach out. When he did, the account was less comprehensive. Danny's version assigned considerably more agency to Iris than Iris's version assigned to herself. This was, Margaret said, entirely predictable. The two accounts would be examined together, cross-referenced against the documentary evidence, and whatever truth existed between them would emerge through that process. Courts are good at this. The machinery is slow, but it does not miss much. The restaurant continued operating during all of this. Margaret's emergency injunction had frozen the fraudulent amendment and restored my documented status as co-managing member. This meant that for the first time since Danny had closed the office door on a Tuesday morning and started the proceedings that had led here, I was legally present in my own restaurant, with the full weight of the original operating agreement behind me. I did not make a production of returning. I arrived on a Thursday morning at the time I had always arrived. I walked through the front door, past the dining room, through the kitchen entrance. Mai was at the prep station. She looked up when I came in. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, the contained nod of someone who has been waiting for something to be restored and is not surprised that it has been, only relieved. I walked through the kitchen the way I had walked through it for 30 years. I checked the prep station. I spoke with the morning staff. I went to the back office, opened the warp door with the firm pull it required, sat at the desk, and opened the filing cabinet. The drawer labeled 1992 through 2000 was as I had last seen it. Thinner than it should be, the 1998 folder, still holding only the 2001 address amendment, the original formation documents absent. Iris's attorney had indicated that the copied documents she had retained would be returned as part of the cooperation agreement. They would come back to this drawer eventually, copies rather than originals, but copies made from the originals I held in the tin box, which meant they would be complete and accurate and sufficient. I left the drawer open for a moment, looking at what was missing. Then I closed it and got on with the work. Philip called that evening from Portland. He had been following the developments through Margaret and had questions, most of which I could answer and a few of which were still in process. At the end of the call, after we had covered the practical matters, there was a brief silence of the kind that exists between people who have been through something significant together and are not quite ready to stop being in it. "How are you?" he said. It was the same question he had asked in the alley outside Margaret's building. I had said I was working. That had been true then. It was still true now, but in a different way. The work had changed character. It was no longer the work of gathering and waiting and holding things in order while the moment arrived. It was the ordinary work of a person resuming their life. "I'm here," I said. "That's the right answer for now." He accepted this. He always had. He came by it honestly. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, thinking about the parking garage where Danny and Iris had spoken without checking for columns, about the moment Iris had said my lawyer instead of our lawyer, about Gerald Park in his gray suit, cleaning out his office in a glass tower on Central Avenue, the folder he'd always kept his eyes on, now likely the one containing his own liability. Danny had stood in the dining room in his formal jacket and told me I was welcome to visit as a customer. He had patted my shoulder with the proprietary pat of a person who has decided the matter is finished. He had walked back through the restaurant nodding to the staff, Iris a half step behind, both of them moving with the ease of people who own what they are walking through. None of it had ever been his to own. Not the room, not the table, not the fan Vincent had installed himself because a wobbling fan was bad for the mood. Not the staff who had stayed for 11 years and 16 years and 9 years because the place was worth staying in. Not the red on the walls, the right red, the second Sunday's red, the color of something that lasts. He had walked through it all as though ownership were simply a matter of paperwork filed in the right office. He had not understood that a restaurant, like most things that endure, is not made of its documents. It is made of what happened inside it. The labor and the early mornings and the midnight prep and the decisions made in the back office with the door that required a firm pull to close. He had understood none of that. And in not understanding it, he had underestimated the person who had built it. I set down the phone. I lit the evening incense and stood at the altar for a moment, looking at Vincent's photograph. The same expression. Present, just entirely himself. I had one more thing to do. One more chapter of this, and then I would be done with it, not finished in the sense of forgetting, but finished in the sense of resolution, the way a long piece of work is finished when the last element is in place, and the whole holds together, and there is nothing left to add. Tomorrow, I would begin it. Tonight, I let the incense burn, and I let the house be quiet, and I let the lane outside move through its evening sounds, and I sat with the particular feeling of a person who has done what needed doing and is not yet at rest but can finally, after a very long time, see the way there. The civil case settled on a Wednesday morning in early spring. I was not in the courtroom when it happened. Margaret had told me I did not need to be, that the settlement terms had been negotiated through the separate attorneys over the previous 3 weeks, that the final signatures were a procedural conclusion to something that had already been decided. She called me from the building steps when it was done, her voice carrying the particular quality of restrained satisfaction that belongs to people who have done careful work and watched it hold. "It's finished," she said. "The amendment is permanently voided. Your co-managing membership is fully restored on the official record. Danny has relinquished any claim to sole ownership. The financial penalties are documented and will be paid out over 36 months. A brief pause, and Gerald Park has surrendered his law license. I was standing in the restaurant kitchen when she called. The lunch prep was underway around me. The familiar sounds, the rhythms I had helped establish 30 years ago, and that had continued through everything, through Vincent's illness, through his death, through the months when my name had been removed from the place it had always belonged. The kitchen had kept its rhythm regardless. Good kitchens do. They are built on something more durable than paperwork. "Thank you, Margaret," I said. "Thank your husband," she said. "He kept good records." After I hung up, I stood at the pass-through for a moment and watched the kitchen work. Mai was at the center of it, moving with the efficient calm of someone who has been doing something long enough that it no longer requires conscious effort, only attention. She looked up and caught my eye. I nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. The formal resolution came in a document from the state registry 2 weeks later, delivered by regular mail in a plain envelope with no drama. I opened it at the kitchen table, read it through once, and placed it in the tin box on top of everything else. The EIN letter from 1994. The original operating agreement, Vincent's handwritten note. The document that voided the fraud. 30 years of building, in a box that had once held almond cookies. I closed the lid. I set it back on the shelf beside Vincent's photograph. Philip flew in the weekend after the settlement. He did not ask to see the documents or the legal correspondence. He came to cook, which was how he had always processed things that were too large for words. He came to the kitchen, to the practical and the tactile, to the work of feeding people. He made the soup my mother had taught me and I had taught him, the one we served every Lunar New Year, the one that required 3 hours and patience and the particular attention of someone who understands that the final flavor depends on everything that happens in the hours before the serving. We ate at the family table, the corner table, Philip's table, the one we had always kept for family. The restaurant was quiet, closed for the evening, the dining room lit at low level, the kitchen sounds faded to the hum of the equipment on standby. Philip said, "What happens with Danny now?" I considered the question, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give it the weight it deserved. "He has his life," I said, "such as it is now." I had heard, through the ordinary channels of information that move through families, whether you seek them or not, that Iris had moved out of the apartment they had shared. that the separation was permanent, that Danny was working at a logistics company, managed by a former colleague, doing work entirely unrelated to the restaurant, living in a smaller apartment in a quieter part of the city. I had heard these things without pleasure and without grief. They were simply what had happened. Actions had produced consequences in the way that actions always do, regardless of whether the people who took them had considered that possibility. I had not spoken to Danny since the preliminary hearing. He had not reached out. I understood this, in the way that I had come to understand many things about my younger son that I wished were different and had accepted were what they were. Philip was looking at me in that careful way of his. "Do you think you'll ever—" "I don't know," I said. "Not yet." I looked at the table between us. The familiar surface I had looked at for 30 years across meals and homework and arguments and silences. Some things take longer than others. I'm not closing the door. I'm leaving it where it is for now. He nodded. He understood leaving things where they are. After dinner, after Philip had gone to bed in the room he had always occupied in this house, I went to the front room and lit the evening incense and stood at the altar. The photograph, the small vase with its fresh flowers, the tin box on the shelf to the right. I stood there for a long time. I thought about what I wanted the restaurant to become, not in the legal sense that was settled, the record corrected, the name restored. I meant in the forward sense, what it was for, who it served, what came after. There was a young woman named Lynn who had been working the front of house for 18 months. She was 26, the daughter of a woman who had been a regular customer for years, and she had started as a part-time server and had gradually taken on more scheduling, supplier communication, the early morning inventory checks that required both diligence and judgment. She reminded me of no one except herself, which was the best thing I could say about a person. I had been watching her the way I watched everything that mattered steadily, without announcing it, accumulating observation, until the picture was complete enough to act on. The week after the settlement, I asked her to stay after the lunch service. We sat at the corner table. I told her what I had been observing. I told her what I thought the restaurant needed over the next 10 years. I told her that I was 68 years old and intended to work for as long as work was possible, but that intention and possibility were different things, and the restaurant deserved someone who was learning its full architecture now, while there was still time to learn it properly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're asking me to help run it." "I'm asking you to learn to run it," I said. "There's a difference. One takes a few months. The other takes years. I'm offering you the years." She looked at the dining room. The same look I had given many rooms over my life, the look of someone calculating not just what is there but what could be there, what the space is capable of if the right things happen inside it. "Yes," she said, "I want to learn it." Good. Margaret had helped me update the operating agreement the week before. Lynn's name was not on it yet. That would come in time. As trust accumulated and capability proved itself, as it always must, but the structure was there. The foundation. The same care Vincent had applied to the original. The same understanding that what you build matters less than how you build it. And that how you build it determines whether it holds. The incense had burned low. The front room was quiet. Outside, the lane carried its ordinary evening sounds, the city doing what cities do, indifferent and continuous. I looked at Vincent's photograph. I had spent the last several months understanding something that I thought I had already understood and had not fully. I had thought I knew what we had built together. I had thought the restaurant was the thing we built, but the restaurant was only where the building happened. What we had actually built was harder to point to and more durable. It was in the kitchen that ran without being supervised. In Mai, who had held documents in a canvas bag for weeks because she understood what they meant. In Philip, who came home when it mattered. In Lynn, who had said yes before she knew everything and meant it. In the tin box. In 30 years of receipts and records and the habit of preservation. In a signature that had a particular pull at the base of the first stroke, distinctive enough to survive any attempt to replace it. In the patience to wait for the right moment. My mother had said it the way she said, everything that mattered plainly, without performance, as a simple fact about how the world worked. She had said it standing in a kitchen that was not large enough, running a household on what was available, building something in conditions that did not invite building. She had said it to herself as much as to me. A reminder, and also a description. Still water runs deepest. I had been still for 30 years, and in that stillness I had moved everything that needed moving, and the restaurant stood with my name on it, and Vincent's note was in the tin box, and Lynn was learning the full architecture. And the incense rose in thin white lines toward a ceiling that had held against everything that had tried to bring it down. I was not the cook. I never had been. I was the still water, and I was exactly where I had always been. If anyone in your life has ever looked at you and decided you were finished, that your age made you invisible, that your silence meant you had nothing left, that your kindness was weakness, they could take advantage of. This story was for you. You are not invisible. You never were. The ones who underestimate you have simply forgotten what still water can do. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe so you never miss another one. New stories are posted every single day, and every one of them is for people like us. Now we want to hear from you. If you were Han, would you have opened that door to reconciliation with Danny, or would you have walked away for good?